The Amityville Horror. The House on Ocean Avenue. I'll never forget the first time I saw that house. It was a cold day in December, a few weeks before Christmas in 1975. My wife Kathy and I were driving through Amityville, a quiet little village on Long Island, New York. We were looking for a new home, a place where we could settle down with our 3 children and escape the stress of city life. When we pulled up to 112 Ocean Avenue, something about the house drew us in immediately. It was big, 3 stories tall with a gabled roof and those infamous quarter-moon windows that stared out from the attic like watchful eyes. The realtor had told us that the house had a tragic past, but we weren't superstitious. We believed in hard facts, not ghosts or spirits. It was a beautiful house, and we couldn't believe it was listed at such a low price. It wasn't until we stood on the front lawn that the gravity of what had happened there sank in. "It's the DeFeo house," Kathy whispered, gripping my arm. She didn't need to say more. Everyone in Long Island knew about the DeFeo murders. Just over a year ago, in November of 1974, Ronald DeFeo Jr. had taken a rifle and systematically shot and killed his entire family as they slept, his parents and 4 younger siblings. It was a massacre that had shocked the nation, especially in a place like Amityville where violent crime was rare. But standing there in front of that house, I didn't feel the weight of the tragedy. I felt a strange pull, almost as if the house was calling to me. It was huge, more than enough space for our family, and the price was a steal. We couldn't afford to pass it up. "We'll make new memories here," I told Kathy, trying to reassure her. "It's just a house." Looking back now, I can't help but wonder if the house had already started working its influence on us that day, whispering its dark secrets into our minds, planting the seeds of fear that would soon take root. But at the time, we were excited. We were young, and the thought of owning a house like this was too good to resist. We bought the house within days, and on December 18th, we moved in. Our first night in the house was uneventful, almost peaceful. Kathy and I were exhausted from moving, and after we got the kids settled in their rooms, we collapsed into bed. The house was quiet, too quiet maybe. I had grown up in the city, where there was always some background noise, the hum of traffic, the distant murmur of people outside, the occasional honk of a horn. But here in Amityville, the silence was absolute. I lay in bed, listening to the creaks and groans of the old house settling around us. It was an old structure, built in the 1920s, so I expected it to make some noise. But there was something about the way the house seemed to breathe around us, like it was alive, that made me uneasy. The kids seemed to adjust right away, though. They were excited to have so much space. My sons, Danny and Chris, shared a room on the 2nd floor, while our daughter Missy had a smaller bedroom down the hall. Kathy and I were on the 3rd floor, just beneath the attic. The house was huge, with plenty of space for all of us, but it wasn't long before we began to realize that we weren't alone. It started with small things you wouldn't notice right away unless you were looking for them. Cold spots, for instance. I remember one evening Kathy was standing in the kitchen preparing dinner when she suddenly shivered. "Did you feel that?" she asked. "Feel what?" I replied, looking up from the newspaper. "Cold. Just cold." I got up and walked over to her, but when I stood next to her, the temperature seemed normal. She shrugged it off, but over the next few days, we began to notice cold spots all over the house. They would appear suddenly, for no apparent reason, and then disappear just as quickly. At first, we blamed it on drafts. After all, it was December, and the house was old. But no matter how much we tried to explain it away, the cold spots kept coming back. One particularly unsettling moment happened when Missy, our youngest, came downstairs one morning with a strange expression on her face. "Daddy," she said, tugging at my sleeve, "Jody says she doesn't like it here." I frowned. "Who's Jody, honey?" "My friend," she said matter-of-factly, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "She's a pig." Kathy and I exchanged worried glances. Missy had always had a vivid imagination, but this was something new. We tried not to make a big deal out of it, thinking it was just a phase, but from that day forward, Missy insisted that her imaginary friend Jody was real, and that Jody didn't want us in the house. The cold spots weren't the only strange thing we noticed in the house. Not long after we moved in, a foul odor began to seep through the walls. It was a rancid, almost sulfuric smell that seemed to come and go at random. No matter how much we cleaned or aired out the house, the smell would always come back. Sometimes it was strongest in the kitchen, sometimes in the living room, and occasionally it would even drift upstairs into the bedrooms. At first, I thought it might be a problem with the plumbing, but when we called in a contractor to check the pipes, he couldn't find anything wrong. There was no logical explanation for the smell, just as there was no explanation for the cold spots. But the worst part was the way the house seemed to change at night. During the day, the house felt almost normal. Sure, there were strange odors and occasional drafts, but it was still just a house. At night, though, everything changed. The air felt heavier, like the house was pressing down on us. The creaks and groans that I had attributed to the house settling now seemed to come from something deeper, something alive. I tried to brush it off as paranoia, but Kathy felt it too. She started waking up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, convinced that someone or something was watching us. And then there were the voices. It was subtle at first, so subtle that I thought I was imagining it. Late at night, as I lay in bed trying to fall asleep, I would hear faint whispering. It sounded like it was coming from inside the walls, like someone, or a group of people, was having a conversation just out of earshot. The whispers were too soft to make out any words, but they were constant, a low, murmuring hum that seemed to echo through the house. At first, I thought it might be the wind. The old house had plenty of nooks and crannies where the wind could slip through, creating strange noises. But the more I listened, the more convinced I became that it wasn't the wind at all. The voices were too regular, too deliberate. It was as if the house itself was talking to us, or worse, about us. One night I got up and pressed my ear to the wall, trying to hear the whispers more clearly. I stood there for what felt like hours, listening. The voices seemed to shift and change, but no matter how hard I concentrated, I couldn't make out what they were saying. I wasn't the only one who heard them. One morning, Kathy came down to breakfast looking pale and shaken. "I heard them last night," she said quietly, as she poured herself a cup of coffee. "Heard what?" I asked, though I already knew what she was going to say. "The voices," she whispered. "They were coming from the walls." We tried to tell ourselves that it was just our imagination, that the stress of moving and the weight of the house's history was getting to us. But deep down, we both knew that something was very wrong. The house wasn't just haunted by the memory of the DeFeo murders, it was alive. The attic had always felt like a place we shouldn't go, though neither Kathy nor I ever said it out loud. After we moved in, we stored a few old boxes up there, but otherwise, we kept the door closed. It wasn't until late January that I ventured up, driven by a sense of curiosity I couldn't shake. The moment I opened the attic door, the air felt thick and oppressive. A strange chill greeted me, though the rest of the house was warm. It was darker than I remembered, even though there was a window in the back. I turned on the single light bulb, which flickered weakly, casting long shadows across the dusty floorboards. At first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Old boxes, a few forgotten toys, and some furniture the previous owners had left behind. But as I stepped further in, I noticed something strange. A corner of the attic where the temperature dropped suddenly. It was as if the cold spots that had appeared around the house all centered here. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and just as I was about to leave, I saw it. A small circular stain on the floor, near the far wall. It was faint, but unmistakable. Blood. Missy's obsession with her imaginary friend Jody continued to grow. At first, it had seemed like a harmless phase, but soon we began to worry. She would sit in her room for hours, talking in hushed tones, laughing as if someone else were there. One afternoon, I walked past her room and overheard her conversation. "No, Jody," Missy said. "I don't want to. That's bad." I stopped in the hallway, frozen. My heart raced as I listened to her next words. "You don't like Daddy? Why not?" I pushed open the door and Missy turned to look at me with wide, innocent eyes. "Daddy," Jody says you shouldn't be here." The room felt colder than usual. I smiled weakly, trying not to let my discomfort show. "Missy, there's no Jody, honey. It's just your imagination." Missy frowned and shook her head. "She's real, she's a pig, but she can talk. She says bad things sometimes." Kathy and I discussed it later that night, both feeling uneasy. Missy was too young to understand the history of the house. Could she be sensing something we couldn't? While trying to make sense of the house's strange behavior, I decided to explore the basement, hoping to find a rational explanation for the cold spots and smells. The basement was damp and musty, the kind of place you only went when you had to. As I moved through the clutter, I noticed something odd behind a stack of boxes, an unfinished section of the wall, hidden from view. Curious, I moved the boxes aside and discovered a small door, barely tall enough to crawl through. I had never noticed it before. My pulse quickened as I crouched down and opened it. The space beyond was small, just big enough for one person to stand in. The walls were painted red, and the air was thick with an unbearable smell. It was unlike anything I had ever encountered in the house before, a mixture of decay and something more sinister, almost as if the very air in that room was toxic. I backed out quickly, but not before hearing something faint, a low whisper coming from deep within the walls. Kathy's sleepless nights were becoming more frequent. She would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, trembling, unable to speak. She would lie there beside me, staring at the ceiling, her breath shallow and panicked. One night she shook me awake. "I saw something," she whispered. "In the mirror." I sat up, my heart racing. "What did you see?" Kathy hesitated, her voice trembling. "It was a face, but not mine. It was evil, George. It was staring back at me." I tried to reassure her, but my words felt hollow. The house was changing us. I could feel it in the way we moved, the way we spoke to each other. We were on edge, always waiting for something to happen. And then it did. The strangest things started happening to me. I would lose time, entire hours slipping by without me realizing it. I would find myself standing in places I didn't remember going, or holding objects I didn't remember picking up. Kathy noticed it too. She said I was becoming more distant, more aggressive. There were moments when I felt like I wasn't in control, like something was taking over, pushing me to do things I would never normally do. I started snapping at the kids, yelling for no reason. I would wake up in the middle of the night, covered in sweat, standing at the foot of our bed, not knowing how I got there. One night I found myself in the basement, standing in front of the red room. I had no memory of coming down there. The door was open, and the whispers were louder now, clearer. They were calling to me, urging me to come inside. I slammed the door shut and ran upstairs, my heart pounding in my chest. But the feeling lingered. The house was inside me now, whispering its dark secrets into my mind, and I didn't know how much longer I could resist. By early February, the house's oppressive atmosphere had consumed our daily lives. The cold spots grew more frequent, and the smell of decay seemed to linger in the air no matter what we did. Worse still, the voices in the walls were getting louder. They were no longer a faint whisper. They had become a constant murmuring presence, like something unseen was always watching, waiting. One evening, as we sat down for dinner, Kathy suddenly froze, her eyes widening in terror. Her fork clattered onto her plate, and she gripped the edge of the table with white-knuckled hands. "What is it?" I asked, my heart racing. She didn't answer at first, just stared across the room. Then, in a shaking voice, she said, There's someone standing behind you." I turned, but no one was there. The dining room was empty except for us, but I felt it, a presence. The hairs on my neck stood up as a chill swept through the room. Kathy refused to eat that night. She said she could feel something in the house, something malevolent that was getting stronger. And I couldn't deny it anymore. There was something in this house, and it was feeding off our fear. Chapter 12. Missy's Warning. Missy's behavior grew more concerning. She spent more and more time with Jody, her imaginary friend, and her conversations became increasingly disturbing. One morning, she came downstairs with a solemn expression, her eyes wide and unblinking. "Jody says we need to leave," she said quietly, looking directly at me. I knelt down in front of her, trying to hide my growing unease. "Why, sweetie?" "She says the house doesn't like you, Daddy. It wants you to go away." My stomach churned. "Missy, it's just a house. There's nothing to be afraid of." Missy shook her head, her expression eerily serious for a 6-year-old. "Number, the house is angry. It told Jody it's going to hurt you." Kathy overheard and rushed to my side, pulling Missy into her arms. We tried to comfort her, to convince her it was all in her imagination. But deep down I knew something was terribly wrong. The house wasn't just influencing me, it was getting to all of us. As the days went on, the sightings of shadowy figures became more frequent. Kathy and I would catch glimpses of dark shapes moving in the corners of our vision, only to disappear when we turned to look directly at them. One night as I lay in bed, unable to sleep, I saw it, clear as day. A tall, shadowy figure standing at the foot of our bed. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but its presence was suffocating. I tried to call out to Kathy, but my voice wouldn't come. It felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. I blinked and the figure was gone. But the feeling remained, like the house was watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. Kathy experienced the same thing the next night. She woke up screaming, convinced that the shadow had been standing over her, watching her sleep. In a desperate attempt to understand what was happening, I started researching the house's history. I already knew about the DeFeo murders, but I was certain there was more to it. Something older, something darker. What I found confirmed my worst fears. Before the DeFeo family, the house had belonged to several different owners, many of whom had reported strange occurrences. But the most disturbing discovery was about the land itself. Long before the house was built, the land had been used by a cult in the early 20th century. Rumors swirled about dark rituals, human sacrifices, and attempts to summon spirits from beyond. It was said that the land had been cursed, that something evil had been bound to it, waiting for the right moment to awaken. And now, that evil had found us. The night it all came to a head was one I will never forget. The house seemed to come alive that evening. Doors slammed shut on their own. The temperature dropped to near freezing, and the oppressive feeling that had been growing over the past months became unbearable. Kathy and I lay in bed, too terrified to sleep. The voices in the walls had grown louder, almost like chanting now. I could hear Missy talking to Jody in her room, her voice eerily calm. Then, around 3 a.m., it happened. A loud crash echoed through the house, followed by the sound of footsteps running up the stairs. Kathy screamed as the door to our bedroom slammed open, and the shadowy figure appeared in the doorway. It didn't move, just stood there watching us. But I felt its intent, malice, anger, hunger. It wanted something from us, and it wasn't going to leave until it got it. I grabbed Kathy's hand, and we ran. We ran down the stairs, past the shadow, out the front door, and into the freezing night. The house loomed behind us, dark and silent, but I could still feel its presence, pulling at us, trying to drag us back inside. We never went back. Epilogue. Leaving it behind. We left everything behind that night, our furniture, our clothes, our memories. We sold the house at a loss, desperate to be rid of it. But the house never really left us. It stayed in our dreams, in the shadows of our thoughts, a constant reminder of the nightmare we had lived through. To this day, I don't know what was haunting that house, whether it was the spirits of the DeFeo family, the curse on the land, or something else entirely. All I know is that it wanted us, and if we hadn't left when we did, I'm not sure we would have survived. We fled that night with nothing but the clothes on our backs. Our children were asleep when we bundled them into the car, and I'll never forget the way Missy looked over her shoulder as we sped away from the house, her eyes wide as if she could still see something lurking in the windows. For days, we stayed at a hotel, too scared to return. I called a priest, begging him to go to the house and bless it, to drive out whatever evil was there. But after the priest visited, he told us something chilling. "There's something in that house," he said, his voice shaking. "Something that doesn't want to leave." Kathy and I couldn't bring ourselves to go back. It was as if the house had marked us, leaving an imprint on our souls. We decided to sell the house at a loss. We didn't care about the money anymore. We just wanted to be free. But as the weeks went on, we realized the house wasn't finished with us. The nightmares started soon after we left. At first, it was just Kathy and I, but eventually the kids started having them too. In the dreams, we were back in the house, trapped, unable to escape. I could hear the voices again, whispering from the walls, growing louder and louder until they were all I could hear. Kathy would wake up screaming, drenched in sweat, convinced that something was standing at the foot of the bed. I would lie awake for hours, listening to the creaks and groans of the hotel room, wondering if the house's presence had followed us. Missy's dreams were the worst. She would wake up in the middle of the night crying, saying that Jody had come to visit her. "Jody says the house misses us," she would say, her voice trembling. "She says we need to go back." We didn't know what to do. How do you escape something that can follow you anywhere, even into your dreams? Desperate for answers, I started digging deeper into the house's history. I contacted local historians, psychics, anyone who might be able to explain what was happening. What I discovered was even more horrifying than I could have imagined. The house's curse went back further than the DeFeo murders, much further. Long before the house was built, the land had been the site of Native American burial grounds. The Shinnecock tribe believed the land to be cursed, a place where dark spirits gathered. The cult that had later used the land had only worsened the curse, summoning something they couldn't control. And then there were the other families who had lived there before the DeFeos. Most of them had left under strange circumstances, sudden illness, unexplained deaths, or simply vanishing without a trace. It was as if the house consumed everyone who lived there, feeding off their fear and despair. I knew then that we had narrowly escaped the same fate. We sought out another priest, this time a renowned exorcist who had dealt with cases of demonic possession. He listened carefully as we recounted our experiences, his face growing graver with each passing detail. "You were dealing with something far more powerful than a simple haunting," he told us. "That house, it's a gateway." "A gateway to what?" Kathy asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "To something evil, something that feeds on fear. Once it gets a foothold, it spreads like a cancer. The longer you stay, the more it consumes you. You did the right thing by leaving." We asked if there was any way to stop it, to sever the connection between us and the house. The priest shook his head. "You may never fully escape it, but you can weaken its hold. Pray, surround yourself with light, and never ever go back." We took his advice, filling our new home with symbols of protection, crosses, holy water, candles, anything that could help us feel safe. But the house was always there, lurking in the back of our minds. In time, the nightmares lessened and the presence of the house faded into the background. We tried to move on, to rebuild our lives. We moved to a new town, far away from Amityville, and never spoke of the house again. But every so often something would happen to remind us that we weren't truly free. A strange noise in the middle of the night, a cold draft that came from nowhere, the feeling of being watched, even when we were alone. It was as if the house was still reaching out to us, trying to draw us back. Missy never fully recovered. Even as she grew older, she insisted that Jody was still with her. She refused to talk about the house, but I could see it in her eyes, that lingering fear, that sense of something unfinished. Years later, when our children were grown and had moved out, Kathy and I decided to return to Amityville just once to face our fears. The house had new owners by then, but I needed to see it one last time, to know if it still had power over me. We stood across the street looking at the house from a distance. It looked different, smaller somehow. The windows were dark and there was no sign of the malevolent presence we had once felt. But as I stood there staring at the house, I could feel it, just beneath the surface. The house was still watching, still waiting. We didn't stay long. As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something watching us from the attic window. But there was nothing there. The house was behind us now. But I knew deep down that it would never truly let us go. We survived the Amityville house, but it left its mark on us in ways that can never be erased. The fear, the darkness, it's always there, lurking just beneath the surface. I don't know if the house is still haunted. Maybe the new owners have found a way to live with it, or maybe they'll fall victim to the same terror that nearly destroyed us. But I do know one thing. There are places in this world that are touched by evil. Places where the boundary between our world and something darker is thin. And the house on Ocean Avenue is one of those places. As for us, we've moved on the best we can. We've built new memories, new lives. But the house will always be a part of us, a shadow that follows us wherever we go. We may have left the house, but in a way it will never leave us.